The composition, ideas to improve your layouts. If you've ever been to Design&Make.com, you'll see that our store is packed jam full of great single models, and a lot of them have been designed to be put together to create a layout or a composition. Quite often we get people giving us a call or emailing us saying, it's really difficult to do a really good job. We can come up with some very basic layouts, but to come up with something that really is super nice is very difficult. They ask us things like, my components look as if they're just stuck in, as if they're kind of just stuck on top of the landscape that's there. Is there anything I can do to make them look better? I really want to add some depth to my layouts. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on how I can make that happen? In VCarve Pro or Desktop, I can't edit my models, so if I have to fit them into a specific area, do you have any tips on how I can do that? And even better is when they say, hey, I have a layout, but could you have a look at it and let me know if there's anything you think I can do to make this better? My goal as a designer is always to create something that has an emotional connection either for me or the viewer or the person that's going to receive this. Sounds pretty easy, right? Well, actually it is pretty easy once you get a few tips under your belt. First thing you need to remember is that a good layout is very subjective. Think of this, for instance, this scenario. Somebody walks into your shop, maybe a friend, a relative, maybe a possible client, and they say to you, we have a beautiful cottage out in the middle of the woods. It's very picturesque on a lake. We have deer and Canada geese that fly by all the time. And we want something to hang outside of our house that reflects where we are, what we like about the area, and then also sets it up so that we can have a conversation piece when new guests come to visit. And this is what we're thinking. And they pass you this sheet of paper. It's not bad, but I think that with some of the models that we have at Design&Make, we can make a pretty convincing layout to show the customers at first. So let's start off with the lake scene. It's quite a picturesque lake scene. We can bring in a deer. We can overlay a Canada goose. We can bring in a sun. Maybe add some ducks to the water for a little bit of more natural flavor. And then we're going to use the wavy tile end to create a frame around this. Now overall, this layout was created very basically, only merging components into one another and adjusting the shape height, adding a bit of base height, and then making sure it all fits into our material thickness. And it's not really a bad layout. It looks really good. And I think that we've achieved the goal that the customer wanted. But I think we can make it better. So by rearranging the layout just slightly, maybe introducing a couple extra models, and adding a bit of tilt and fade to some of the components to make them fit in better, and then pile in a lot of creativity. So now it's time for a demo. I'm going to do this demo in VCarve Desktop, but it could also be done in VCarve Pro or Aspire, and also, of course, it uses some of the content that you can find on Design&Make.com. Let's have a look at the file that we saw at the very end of the presentation a minute ago. This is VCarve Pro. Anything that we do in VCarve Pro, we can also do in VCarve Desktop and Aspire. The tools are available in all three packages. So let's just go ahead and take a look at our 3D view. There's nothing shown here right now, but let's check and see what our job setup is. So it's a single-sided model. The width is 24 inches, the height is 18 inches, and the thickness is 1 inch. Now, my plan is that 3/4 of an inch of that material is going to be for the actual layout or the composition, and then we're going to have a 1/4 inch left over for the backing, for the background, which would be great, I think, and make it quite sturdy. The other thing I want to point out is it's a very high resolution, modeling resolution, so you want to make sure you keep it up there if your computer can handle it, so that we get the best detail that we can. Let's just click OK. Now we're going to go over to the Clip Art tab, to the Modeling tab, and then we are going to go ahead and look at the layout, and we're going to build it up from bottom to top. And as you can see, all of the components have been turned off, but they're all merged components. So let's go ahead and show our lake scene. Let's look straight down on our layout. Our deer, our goose, the sun or moon, the ducks, and then the 4 wavy tiles to make up our frame. So that looks pretty good. And when I set this up originally, I took a really close look at it, and my plan is that the top edge of this frame would be flush with the top of my board or my material, and everything else needs to fit within that space. So if we roll this up on its edge and take a look down it, everything is tucked in there nice and neat and tidy, and nothing is proud of the actual border, so that's great. Let's take a closer look at some of our components. First of all, the duck and the deer look like they're just kind of stuck in there. So we want to work on that a little bit. There's no real movement to either one of these. Looks like they're just kind of standing very still. If we look at the deer, you'll see that the legs are quite thin, and that could be a trouble spot when we go to machine this. They could either break or chip really quite easily. And the same thing with the antlers. They're quite small. Also, if we take a look at the background, the lake scene, there's still lots of space here that we can fit that into, and we won't be machining away so much wood. And we'll also get more detail in our background scene if we try to scale that up a little bit. Now the goose, he's just kind of stuck in there, and what we want to do is I want to take a look at that goose model a little bit closer before we go into doing too much editing. So if I go over to my component tree and I select the goose and I right click on it and I go down to show only this, then it'll turn off everything else but the goose. Now if we roll the goose up on its edge, you'll see the way it's shaped. It's kind of high in the middle, so we need to keep that in mind. That is a bit of a limitation of this model, so if we tilt or fade it, we need to keep in mind that this could be the high point of our component, and we want to make sure that we're just aware of that. So let's just go ahead and right click on that again, go down to show, and then we're going to show all components again. Let's take a look down at this, and let's start to do a bit of editing. So we are going to select the deer, and we're going to move him down to the foreground and make him a bit bigger. Now in doing that, what we're going to do is everything gets scaled up. So that means his antlers get a little bit thicker, his legs get a little bit thicker, and but also the shape height and the base height will change. So we need to roll this up on its edge and just take a really quick peek, and we'll see that the stomach of the deer is proud of our actual border. So we should probably take a look at that and fix it. So for this deer, we're going to go ahead and click on this, because it's selected, the dark blue square underneath the deer, and that will bring up our floating properties dialog box. And if we add these numbers in our head, we can tell that they're actually more than 3/4 of an inch. So let's just go ahead and change those numbers so that we get something that's closer to the number that we need, which is around 0.7 right now. And if we go ahead and roll this up again on its edge, we'll see that our deer fits in there much better now, just below the surface, which is perfect. Now if we take a close look at this, you'll see that the antlers are still quite proud of the background, and we can fix that by a couple things. One is if we scale up the actual background, then that should fill in some of that space. So let's just go ahead and give that a shot. Now the upshot of this is going to be that we will get more detail in our background if we scale it up. So let's try it at 0.75. Press the space bar. And that fills in a lot of this extra space, but we end up losing our deer in the process. Now also on the other side of our model or our composition, we lose our part of our goose as well. But we're going to ignore what's happening over here with the goose right now. We're going to come back to that later. But right now we're more worried about our deer. So let's just go ahead and change that to 1/2 inch. You'll see that I use round numbers when I'm doing this. It just makes it easier for me to keep track, along with I'm not guessing, and I have a really good idea that how much space I have left. So that looks pretty good. The antlers, though, are still tucked into the trees a little bit, but I'm really happy with the amount of detail I'm getting in my mountains, in the trees, and also in the water. So let's go back to our deer again and see if we can do something with him to make things a little bit better. Oops, let's just undo that. And let's just go ahead and move over a bit. So if we have him selected, we can go ahead and use the tilt feature. So what the tilt feature does is it adds sort of a virtual wedge underneath your component from 2 anchor points. The first anchor point being the very thin part of a wedge, and the second part of the second anchor point is the wider part of the wedge. So if we go ahead and select tilt, and then we're going to set our 2 anchor points, one down here below the hoof of the deer, and you can see it through our frame because it's shown in green. And I'm going to go up above his head and do that. And then we're going to tilt it by, let's say, 1 degree to start with, and we'll see what we get. And there we are. So it pokes out the top, and everything looks great. Now what we can't tell is what that's done to our total shape or our total component thickness. So we're going to just visually do this. We're going to roll it up on its edge, and again we're going to take a quick peek down it, and I think that we're in pretty good shape still. It's just slightly below the frame, and we fix the antlers. Now let's take a look at his legs. We knew before that they were a bit thin and they could probably chip or break off, and right now they're not too bad, but they're still a little thin. So my rule of thumb is if I have a component that I can add to my layout that fits into the layout, then why not use it to fill in some of these troubled areas. So let's go to our clip art tab, go to my Design and Make folder, and in this I have the Wildlife Scenes collection installed. And if I go down to the duck panel, you'll see that we have a model called, or a component called bushes. If I double click on that, and it will come, and it's a merged component, so it's merged in with everything. So we should move it someplace down here where we can see it a bit better. And I think that'll work really well to kind of cover up some of the things that are happening around the deer's legs. But I don't like that this orientation, the left to right orientation or horizontal orientation, is kind of works its way up from the bottom. I'd like this end to be on the other side. So if we, with that component selected, if I press H on the keyboard, it will flip it over, and that looks better. That's what I like it to look like. Let's slide it into place where I think it should go. Let's scale it up a little tiny bit. There we are. And then we're going to work on our shape height and our base height to get it to fit through our other components. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go with our base height. Let's adjust that, and we're just going to put in some random whole numbers that I like to work with. 0.1. Let's put in 0.15. That looks pretty good. And then we're going to go ahead and change our shape height here to maybe 0.25. And you'll see it starting to fill in. Let's go with 0.35. And that looks pretty good. Let's just add a little bit more to the base height here to cover up his legs. And that looks pretty nice. Let's close this down. Let's take a closer look at that. And to me, that looks very natural. It looks like he's standing in some weeds or some foliage here along the edge of the lake, and that looks perfect. So I'm very happy with that, along with we fixed that part of our layout where it was a bit thin. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to move on to our ducks. As I said earlier, they look like they're just kind of stuck in there. There's no movement in there. And one of the things I like to tell people is that think of other uses for components, not necessarily what they were intended for originally. And so really what I want to do is I want to add in some waves or some texture here so it looks like those ducks are actually floating along in the water. And I found over the years that a cloud works. So in the ducks panel project, there is a set of clouds, and you can't see them very well, but I'm going to pull them down here, and that's what they look like. And if you forget that they're named clouds and think of them more as maybe water or a puddle, then we can use that to fix this area here. So let's move it up to under where the ducks are. Go ahead and bring up our floating properties dialog again. Let's add a little bit of base height to that to bring it up. That looks pretty good. And then we're going to add just a little bit more shape height to that. And there we have, when you unclick it, we have what looks to be the ducks moving in the water and leaving a little bit of trail of wake behind them, which I think looks perfect. Now, while we have that model right there, we may as well do one more thing. We have some negative space up here or some blank areas that we could go ahead and fill with some clouds to kind of fill out the scene. So let's double click on that. And we're going to drag it up top, but we're also going to hold down the control key, and that's going to copy that. So let's just move it over here a little bit. And we're going to go ahead and stretch it up a little bit to give a little bit of a thicker look. I like that. So let's copy that across our center line. So let's go Control, Shift, and H all at the same time, and that will flip our component over to the other side of our layout. And then we're going to press H again on the keyboard to flip it again. And then there we have it. We can go ahead and move that into place, and we now have clouds in the sky. That looks pretty nice. So I think we've dealt with everything on the right hand side of our layout that we need to worry about. Now let's have a look at the left-hand side. Now we know that if we select our goose, you'll see that we have trees poking through his wing and so on, and that doesn't look so great. Along with, I feel that the goose could actually be a very dramatic part of this composition or layout. And right now it is. It's kind of the focal point. It looks really great, but we can make it even more. What if we actually go ahead and bring his wing over top of the bottom of the frame? So it looks like his wing is kind of flapping outside of the window of the frame. Now, as I pointed out earlier, the way that the goose is shaped, if we did that, it would end up getting very thick in the center, and we'd be very proud of the surface of our material, which means that we didn't get cut at all, or we'd end up having to cut deep into the material in order to get everything that we need. So to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and grab the bottom of this frame and hold down my shift key and get the top part. Go ahead back into our floating properties dialog, and we're going to change the height of this to be 0.45. And press the spacebar, and now we've dropped down those top and bottom of the frame. Not only does it give us room now to pop up that wing, but also it adds a little bit more interest to our frame. But in the result of that, it ends up, we'll see we have a bit of a problem over here with our bushes. We're going to come back to that in a bit. We're not going to deal with that right now because we may have to change these top and bottom of our frame again, and we don't want to have to go back and fix it again. So we'll just do it all in one shot. So let's take a look at our goose. Well, we could raise the goose up to be above everything that's in the background, but really the information that's back here behind the goose, all these trees, it isn't really all that important for the layout. So if we go ahead and fade our scene from left to right, then that will end up dropping down the shape height of this end, and it will fit nicely in behind our goose. So let's give that a shot. So let's grab the lake scene, and we're going to bring up our floating properties dialog, and we're going to go ahead and fade it. So we're going to set one of our anchor points over here and the other one way over here, and we're going to fade that to 100%, which means it's going to go right down to nothing on the left hand side, and we'll see what we end up with. But what happens is, seeing as it's fading all the way across, everything is slowly getting muted, or the detail is getting muted as we work across our layout, and that's not exactly what we want. So we want to more selectively control the area that we would like that fade to happen. So if we hit the set button again and reset our anchor points, but we're going to go from here to here instead, we'll see that we get all of the detail back over here. And seeing it's fading from here to there 100%, then we still retain a lot of the detail in behind the goose, the stuff that really isn't bothering us any, but we get our wing back over here. So again, selectively fading, which means kind of like taking, instead of fading all the way across the component, you only fade away half of it, or 3/4 of it, or 1/3 of it, just so you can end up controlling that end of that component. And to me, that looks pretty good. So we're getting closer to the end that we want. So now let's just go ahead and select our goose. Now the easy thing to do is to take our tilt, and we're going to tilt him just like we did the deer, but from here to there. And we're going to tilt him, let's go with 1 degree, and we'll see what happens. It's not quite enough. I don't mind it so much. I don't mind the tips of his feathers sort of dipping into the frame, but I think we can get a little bit more out of that. So let's change that to 2 degrees. And we're going to roll it up on its edge, and we have a bit of a problem now. We'll see that his tail now is starting to show up in here, and that's not so great. So let's just go ahead and take off our base height. Mess around with that, and that'll drop it down right away, which is quite nice. And let's change our actual shape height just a wee bit here, and we're going to backspace that, get rid of the 5, so 0.6, and that'll drop it down a little bit. So I'm pretty happy with that. But now, as I kind of said with the deer, we can see when we roll this up on its edge that the goose is actually proud of, just slightly proud of our frame, which is not what we want right now. Although sometimes in a composition you do want that to stick out a bit, but in my case I don't. So how do I find out what the total shape height is, or component height is? It's hard to add up here. We know it's 0.6, but then there's also this tilt in here. and we can't tell what that is. So the easiest way to do that is to go to our modeling tab, and we're going to use this feature right here called scale Z height of model. So that's just only the visible components will be scaled. So if we right click on that, we go down to show and only this, then we can go ahead and select this, and it will tell us that we are actually at 8. So we're over our 3/4 of an inch. So we're at 0.8 of an inch. So we're going to fix that. So let's set our exact height to be 0.75. We're going to click apply. And some of the detail will be muted slightly, but not enough to make a big difference. Select OK. Right click on our goose, show, and we're going to show all. And now we're sure that he actually fits into our design where he belongs. Okay, so that's fantastic. That works really well. Now, taking a closer look at this, we still have the bushes over here, and we have his little feet here that should really be proud of this bottom border, I think. So again, we're going to use the technique of using a component for something that is not initially meant to be used for. And in VCarve Pro or Desktop, this is really the only way that you can isolate parts of a component and edit it or to make changes to it. So to better explain that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a brand new level. I'm going to right click on level 1 and I'm going to insert a level. Then I'm going to drag my goose up onto that level. And you'll see right away that something goes terribly wrong. That's because this level is being added to our whole composition. But I want to right click on the level and go down to merge, and then everything should look like it did. Then if I hide level 1, then all I'll have is just the goose left. Now what I'd like to do is raise up his feet a little bit to bring them over the edge of that. Now if I tilted it more, then I'll end up having a problem with my overall component height. But if I use a piece of clip art, let's say the deep in the wilds, we have a dome here. It's the sun or the moon. If we double click on that, then that's perfect. If we could get this shape to add to underneath his feet, then that would bring it up above where we need it to be. So let's just go ahead and drag this in. If we look at our modeling tree, we'll see that the sun or moon is being merged into this goose. So it's not really helping us any. It's not adding to it. So we right click and we go combine and we select add. You'll see that now it's being added to it, which is great. And now what we need to do is we just need to make it fit better. So we're going to go ahead and size this down. Slide it underneath his feet. Maybe squish it up a bit. Let's look straight down on our, zoom in a little. Let's rotate that a bit. Kind of fit it where it needs to be. Right around there is pretty good. And let's take a look at our full composition now so we can decide how or what the shape height needs to be of the sun or moon to get this to work. Let's turn back on our level 1 and you'll see that, well, just by a total fluke, that worked out perfect. But we can see the edge of the sun or moon here. So let's turn off this level and let's turn off our goose for a sec. So we can go ahead and use, again, our fade feature. And we can fade that, and we're going to set our anchor points, one in the middle and one off here, and we're going to fade that to 100%. That means this is going to be at 0. So if we go ahead now and turn back on our goose, we should see that it doesn't make much of a difference to our actual shape of our goose, or where it does, you can hardly tell it does. Let's add back in our background, and that looks really good, with the exception of we can see the sun through our water. Well, that's easy to fix. Let's go back to our level 2, go to our clip art. Let's just go back to the duck panel again, and actually I think maybe it's the deer mantle, and we're going to bring in this cluster of rocks. And that cluster of rocks we're going to use just for a bit of texture in behind the goose, which you're really not going to see or really even know it's there. It's just going to blend into the background when you actually cut this. Let's change the shape height of that down to maybe 0.4. Let's close that. Let's zoom back out again. And everything looks pretty good over here. I'm very, very happy with that. It looks great. Now back to our bushes here. We're going to use the same thing that we did with the sun to prop up the goose's legs, but in reverse. We want it to kind of fade the bushes into this border. So we're going to select that, bring up our floating properties dialog again. We're going to fade. We're going to set the 2 anchor points, one right about here and one down in here. And we're going to fade to 50 seems to work. That's pretty good. And then, actually, we're going to make it a little bit less than that. Let's make it 35. It's not going to work. So we got to go back to 50 again. And have a peek at that. And that looks pretty good. And once we unselect it, you can hardly tell that our deer legs are showing a bit. But I'm still not happy with that. So let's just go ahead and select our deer. And we're going to fade his legs in from here down into the actual bushes. And you're never going to be able to tell that I've done that. That looks pretty good. So I'm overall happy with that. Let's just go ahead and we're going to go up to view, and we are going to not draw our modeling plane, and we're going to send this off to our customer for approval. We could do that. There's one last thing I want to do that would help make more sense to the customer. Right now they can see through this. So if you sent this off to a customer, they may expect that you're actually going to be able to see right through this panel, see the wall behind it, which may look pretty neat. But in my case, I don't want that to be that way. So let's double click on the top part of this frame. We're going to hold down our control key and we're just going to drag it down a bit. Then we're going to stretch it out. And then we're going to use this as what I call a filler component. We're going to go ahead and bring up our floating properties dialog again, and we're going to make this super thin. Press the space bar, and there we have it. We have a filler component that's very thin, fills in the background, and gives our customer a much better idea of what they're going to get in the end. And I feel that that's although at the first of this demo, the layout or the composition was wonderful, this composition is much more interesting and it adds a lot more detail and depth and makes me feel something, which is what my goal really was to begin with. Now from start to finish, this was the concept art that we were given by the customer. This is our first layout, a pretty good effort. And this is our final layout that you saw us just modify with the inclusion of some V-carving to make it even more special. So let's just review what we'd seen. We started out with a very basic layout. We took those elements and we added some tilt and fade to get the components to fit in better, and also that ensured that we got the detail that we could get, or the most detail that we could get. We weren't afraid to use components for what they initially were intended to be, like the cloud in the water. We always kept in mind the material thickness that we had to work with. That's very important, so we knew whether or not our components were too high or too low. And then we went back after we were all finished up and we looked at any trouble spots that we needed to fix using some components to lessen that problem. Above all, we were very creative. It doesn't hurt to try things. It doesn't hurt to go in there and overlay objects and see what you can do, add in some more scenery. And if you don't like it, you can just remove it. Your takeaway from this demo you'll find on your USB key. It will be this layout without the V-carving in a V3M format provided to you in an installer that all you need to do is double click on the installer and it will automatically put your V3M file in your Design&Make folder in your software. Now this file is usable in our free Design&Make Machinist software, VCarve Desktop, VCarve Pro, or Aspire. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us.